Her mother hovered. Her hands were palms out. Butterflies fluttered around her. She bobbed a little. Then slowly she drifted upward like milkweed in calm air. She made no effort but for a small movement of her feet, as if she were dabbling her toes in a cool creek. Jane stretched out from the window, holding on to the sides as she watched her mother rise and rise and rise until she was just a white speck in a blue, blue sky. When she was very little, Jade woke up crying each time she had this dream. Now, as a 12-year-old, Jade sometimes thought it might be better to have a dead mother. She was quite certain people didn't float. "Huh!" Jane said aloud, imagining her dad standing in front of her. "You treat me like I was a baby," she muttered. "I know you know what happened to Mama, and one day I'm going to find out whether you like it or not." Jade liked to practice the little speeches she hoped to deliver to her dad someday, and she practiced this speech about finding out about her Mama at least once a week. Jade yanked up her backpack, slung it over her shoulder, and walked home. She and her dad lived in the big house on property that was once owned by Captain John Lipton, who had died a violent death in that very house, and following his demise, the property had been cut up. Jade's dad still had an acre of it. The house sat back from the street behind an old iron fence. Mistletoe draped the trees. In spring and summer, the magnolias perfumed the yard and offered blooms that spread up to 12 inches in diameter. A veranda ran all around the exterior walls of the house. From the yard, you had to go up 5 steps to get to it. Below it was the crawl space where all manner of spiders and wiggling things lived in the dark. The doors were tall, the ceilings were tall. It was lovely and cool in the summer, and the ceiling fans running. But in the winter it was hard to heat. There was no basement. There was the attic. There were so many rooms a family of 14 could have lived in the house and still needed a GPS to find each other. From the time she was a tiny girl, Jade knew the house had secrets. Jade went straight to her room on the 2nd floor of the old mansion and wrote in her notebook under Evan's case information. Team tasks. 1. Make a list of students in the class. 2. Find out which lab table was closest. It should be a relatively simple case unless, as with a few of her earlier ones, the culprit was the last person you suspected. She sat and mulled over what she knew about the case, staying an extra long time in her room, because tonight was her father's night to cook. They took turns. It was Thursday, and they always had hamburgers on Thursday. While her dad finished nuking the burgers, he always cooked them until they were charred to a juiceless cinder, Jade took down the photos from the last case and prepared the whiteboard for the new one. She printed the name of the case and downloaded a picture of Evan and a picture of the type of iPod that had been stolen. These she arranged on the board. The smell of frying hamburgers came from the kitchen below. She went downstairs to the kitchen before he called out to her. August, Jade's father, was reading the evening edition at the kitchen table. There used to be a morning edition too, but the internet and the subsequent decreasing interest in print newspapers had cut the paper to once a day. It was still called the evening edition though, not just the Bonaparte Free Voice. August? Jade ventured as she doused her charred burger in ketchup to make sure she could swallow it. She called him August, not Dad. She didn't remember why that was. He had always just been August. He was a lawyer. He wore suspenders to hold his pants up. Jade? He did not lower his paper. She washed the choking meat down with a swig of milk. Were you in court today? I was. The ice in his tea tinkled as he raised his glass behind the paper to drink. Is it a murder trial? She liked those the best. A preliminary hearing. He lowered his paper. He had not touched his burger. August sometimes forgot to eat, which probably explained why he was so thin. He was a liquids man, sweetened iced tea with lemon or chicory coffee, depending on the time of day and the season. Right now, August had a large glass of iced tea in his hand. Blair Stokes has been accused of killing his wife. Jade, you know I can't talk about my cases. You don't need to be concerned about this. It's just my job." August scooped his wispy hair off his forehead with the cup of his hand and looked hard at Jade. Jade knew that, of course, but she liked the idea of engaging her dad in real conversation instead of the stuff that other parents talked about, like, "How was school today?" She read the evening edition as religiously as August. Online, though. She liked the feel of the newspaper and the smell of ink, but the rule was he got the paper first, since she had the habit of cutting out articles. She remembered him once lifting the paper up at the table and pulling it open. She'd laughed when she saw his surprised face looking at her through the hole, but August hadn't laughed back. In fact, he'd lectured her on being selfish and irresponsible. Thus, the rule was created. He never seemed to finish with the paper, so she had to go online to get her news. As an investigator, she knew it was important that she keep up with the news, and that's how she knew that Mrs. Stokes had been found in the swamp east of town, weighted down by an old outboard motor. "Will you defend him?" "It seems so." "Is he guilty?" she asked, as her father took a long, slow drink out of his glass. "In the eyes of the law, he's innocent until proven guilty." She knew this, but she loved to hear him say it. He believed it. She had used this idea as the foundation of her agency. What kind of agency would she have if she decided ahead of time who was guilty? She gathered facts and then reached logical conclusions, just like her dad. August didn't say it, but Jade knew that even though the odds were against him, Mr. Stokes, like Bobby Lee, was innocent until all the evidence was in and heard. August folded up his paper and walked out without saying anything. That was his way. He really didn't talk much. She could hear August walking down the hall to his study. He had a long stride. He walked like a man in thought. He did not hurry. He had plenty of time between each step to think over an idea or two. She stared blankly at her reflection in the kitchen window, pondering August's ability to defend people when he didn't know whether they were guilty or innocent. There were no curtains, and the darkness of the deepening evening turned the large windows into mirrors. She jumped when she heard Drew's familiar tap at the back door. Drew loved burgers, cooked to a cinder or not. Actually, there wasn't much food that Drew didn't love. He nodded at her and took the cigarette from his lips. He put it behind his ear as he sat down to finish the hamburger her father had only taken a bite of. Drew's signature was the unlit cigarette he dangled from his mouth whenever an adult wasn't in sight. Bobby Lee wasn't even in biology today. He nodded his thanks when Jade put a glass of milk in front of him. Lab table closest was Annabelle, Francis, Ernest, and Jay. "The thing I don't understand," Everett said as he walked in with no knock, no ceremony, turned the chair around and straddled it. "What moron would want to put a bud in his or her ear after it had been in Evan's?" Drew grunted in agreement as he chewed. "I thought of that. Gross." Jade put the dishes in the sink to soak. What would the thief get on the market? This was the underground black market at school, a freewheeling Craigslist, cash purchases only. 20 maybe, Everett said. If the perps clean off the bud first, just knowing the source would undercut the value. Jade fought the image of Evan taking his finger out of his nose and using it to sort his list. She looked in the window glass at the three of them. The scene was illuminated by a single bare bulb. Drew got up and put his plate and glass in the sink. Once seated, he rocked back onto the legs of the chair, zipped his jacket up, and put his hands in his pockets. "We'll have him tomorrow," Drew said. "We should charge more." "Only charge what the market will bear," Everett said. Jade agreed. It was true that many of the kids at the school had parents with money, but it was also true that many had gotten into St. Bartholomew on scholarships and grants. Jade's family was old money, which meant there wasn't any left. The Hills had been in Bonaparte since the French had staked claims. Jade didn't ask, but she figured that keeping her at St. Bartholomew wasn't easy for August. She also figured that this was why he worked such long hours and she rarely got to see him except in the evenings. Jade laid out the next moves in the investigation. While Drew and Everett continued talking, she wrote down the assignments in her spiral notebook.